Today we're sewing Everyday Elegance by Patterns for Pirates. There are a few views offered for this pattern. I'm choosing the collared tunic with the mid-length sleeves and button tabs. This garment is intended to be roomy and a little bit oversized, but I sized down for this pattern, sewing the extra small even though my measurements were at the extra small. And the fit was perfect. I hope you sew along with me today. Let's get started. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice piece and I'm ready to prepare my darts. I'm going to fold each dart in half and pin through one dart leg and out the other. Doing this for both darts. Then I'll take the darts to the sewing machine and sew from the outer edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. And then press those darts downward. Here is the right side of the uppermost edge of my back bodice piece, and I've marked the notches just using pins. To prepare the pleats in the back, we're going to fold the outermost notches so that the material is wrong sides together, and the notches meet each other. Then we're going to take this set of notches and fold it over to the next notch. Once those 3 notches are aligned, pin in place. And repeat on the other side, bringing the outermost notches together, and then bringing that pair of notches over to the next notch. Pin in place. And baste in place. Here is the wrong side of my yoke lining piece. I'm going to take the shoulder edges and fold them to the wrong side by 1/2 inch and press, doing this for both shoulders. Now I'm going to turn my lining piece over so that it's right side up. And I'm going to lay the top edge of my back bodice piece right on top of this lining so that the back bodice piece is also right side up. And then I'll take the outer yoke piece and place it right sides together with the back bodice piece. Now that I have these 3 layers in place, I'm going to pin this top edge. Then we'll sew these 3 layers together from one side to the other with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then press the seam allowance up toward the yoke. Now that seam is sewn, lay both of your yoke pieces out flat and give this yoke seam a good press. Now that seam is pressed, we're going to sew along the bottom of the yoke from one side to the other with an 1/8 inch seam allowance. We're sewing through both yoke layers as well as the seam allowance. To prepare for sewing our V neckline, we're going to be clipping notches into that V area 3/8 inch into the fabric. Just cutting out little triangles of fabric. Make sure that each of those notches are no more than 3/8 inch deep. Now place the center of your placket piece right sides together with the bottom of the V. Open out your V into a straight line, and place the center of your placket piece right sides together with the bottom of the V. And pin in place from the center outward. Then sewing from the wrong side of the front bodice, sew the placket to the front V neckline from one side straight across to the other with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once that's sewn, press that placket seam allowance up toward the placket. Once the seam allowance is pressed, we'll take the outer raw edge of the placket and fold it in half so that it meets the raw edges of the seam allowance, and give that a press. Then we're going to take this top folded edge and fold it over the seam allowance so that our folded edge now covers our stitching line, and pin in place from the front of the garment. Now that I have that pinned, we're going to sew from the front of the garment, top stitching the placket in place on the placket side 1/8 inch away from the seam. making sure that as you sew, you are catching that inner fold of the placket as you go. Now that the placket is applied, we're going to fold the front bodice in half along the V area, right sides together. Double check to make sure that everything aligns from the top of the shoulder to the top of the V. And then we can trim the excess binding. Then, with both sides of the placket still laying on top of each other, we're going to sew across the placket along the bottom of that V section, forming a triangle from the inner folded edge of our placket to the seam line, backstitching to secure. Now that that's sewn, press that section to one side. Now we're going to place the front and back pieces right sides together at the shoulder seams. Make sure that you move the yoke lining out of the way, as we're going to be pinning through the outer yoke and the back piece only. Pin in place. Sew both shoulders with a 1/2-inch seam allowance and press the seams toward the back. Now that the shoulder seams of the main yoke and back bodice are sewn together, open out the front and back bodice pieces away from each other. And we're going to place the shoulder sections of the yoke lining that we pressed to the wrong side earlier over this seam line, so that it just covers the stitching and pin in place from the right side. Doing this at both shoulders. Now I'll flip the bodice to the right side, and we're going to top stitch on the yoke side of the garment 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line from one side of the shoulder to the other. Doing this for both shoulders, periodically checking underneath to make sure that you are catching the top of your interior yoke. Apply your interfacing to the wrong side of your collar lining piece. Now place both collar pieces right sides together and pin along the inner curved edge. Then we're going to sew as pinned with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. And then trim that seam to 1/4 of an inch. Then we're going to clip into the curves, being careful not to clip through your stitching line. Then we can turn this collar piece right side out. Now that it's turned out and pressed, we're going to top stitch along that curved seam line from one center front all the way around to the opposite center front with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to mark the center back of my collar piece with a pin, doing the same for the center back of the neckline. Now place the center back raw edges of your collar right sides together with the raw edges of your center back and pin in place. And then match the center front edges of the collar and the center front of the garment right sides together and pin in place. Doing this on both sides. And then continue pinning the rest of the collar around the neckline. Then we can stitch the collar in place with a 1/2-inch seam allowance from one center front all around the back neckline to the opposite center front. Once it's sewn together, I'm going to finish the raw edges using my serger. Then take it to your ironing board and press your collar seam allowance down toward the bodice. Then we're going to top stitch on the bodice side, tacking down that seam allowance on the inside as we go from one center front all the way around that back neckline, back to the opposite center front with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your button tabs, and then using a zigzag stitch or your serger, finish the bottom short edges. Then take your button tabs to the ironing board and press those finished edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch. Then with that finished edge still pressed to the wrong side, fold each button tab right sides together and pin in place along the side and pointed edge. Doing this for both tabs, and then sew as pinned with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then trim those seam allowances to 1/4 of an inch. Then turn the tabs right side out and give both tabs a good press, making sure that those folded edges are still tucked into the inside. Then we're going to top stitch around the entire perimeter of both tabs with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here is the wrong side of one of my sleeves. I've transferred the square with the X inside it from the pattern piece onto the wrong side of the fabric. Now I'll take one of the button tabs and place the top short edge directly on top of the square. Then we'll take it to the sewing machine and sew that square with the X inside it along that top edge of the button tab, doing this for both sleeve and button tab sets. Then go back to the sewing machine and sew a vertical buttonhole at the point end of your tab, doing this for both tabs. Then open up those buttonholes and turn the sleeve to the right side. I'm going to sew my button directly in the middle of the X that we sewed. And repeating the same to attach the button to your opposite sleeve. Now we're going to sew basting stitches along the top of the sleeve from notch to notch, using the longest stitch on your machine with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance and leaving thread tails on both sides so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Do this for the tops of both sleeves. Open out your front and back bodice, right side facing you, and place the coordinating sleeve right sides together with the arm side, making sure that your single notch matches with the front bodice, and pin in place. On either side of the top of the sleeve, pull your basting stitches so that the sleeve fits perfectly into the top of the armhole. Then sew your sleeve in place with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges. Then place the sleeve right sides together with itself and the front and back bodice pieces right sides together at the side seam, and then pin that seam matching the underarm seam. And repeat for both side seams. Then we'll sew from the bottom of the sleeve across that underarm seam into the bottom of the garment with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then finish the raw edges. For the bottoms of the sleeves, I've chosen to finish those raw edges all the way around and press the finished edges to the wrong side by 1/2 of an inch, doing this for both sleeves. And the hem allowance for the bottom of the garment is also 1/2 of an inch, so I've finished those raw edges and press them to the wrong side by 1/2 inch all the way around the bottom of the garment. Then for the bottom hem as well as for the bottoms of the sleeves, I'm going to edge stitch close to those finishing stitches all the way around. And now your garment is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.